Hi, thanks for joining us for Bible Bootcamp Week 6. In the last session we saw how God instituted kings to rule his people. And under the first three kings, Saul, David and Solomon, every enemy of God's people was subdued and Jerusalem was established as a fortified capital city where God could be worshipped. A temple for God was built by the wise and wealthy Solomon, and his people were riding high. But against God's direct instructions, Solomon began to marry foreign wives, many foreign wives, and he began to adopt their pagan religious practices into the kingdom. He also instituted slave labour. And the upshot was that God was displeased and the kingdom began to falter. So let's see then what happens next as it's described in the books of 1 and 2 Kings.
The next section opens with Solomon's son, Rehoboam, acting just like his father. He tries to increase taxes for slave labor. And under the leadership of Jeroboam, the northern tribes reject this, they rebel and secede, and form their own rival kingdom. And so now in the story, you have the southern kingdom, Judah, centered in Jerusalem with kings from the line of David, and now this new northern kingdom called Israel, whose capital will be Samaria eventually. Jeroboam also goes on to build two new temples to compete with Solomon's temple in the south. He puts a golden calf in each one to represent the God of Israel. The connection to Exodus 32 and the golden calf, it's all quite explicit. From this point on, the story goes back and forth from north to south, tracing the fate of both kingdoms. Did they worship the God of Israel alone, or did they promote the worship of other gods? Did they deal with idolatry among the people? And did they remain faithful to the covenant like David, or do they become corrupt and unjust?
Of the 20 kings that ruled the southern kingdom of Judah, only 8 were any good. But of the 19 kings that ruled Israel in the north, not a single one passed the test. They never turned away from worshipping the golden calves of Jeroboam. And many of them piled a whole host of other sins on top of that. So God began to raise up prophets to hold the kings to account.
Prophets were not fortune tellers. Rather, they spoke on behalf of the God of Israel, and they played the role of covenant watchdogs. And the most prominent prophets are the northern ones, Elijah and his disciple Elisha. Elijah was a wild man of a prophet living out in the desert, and his arch nemesis was the northern king Ahab and his Canaanite wife Jezebel. Together, these two had instituted the worship of the Canaanite god Baal over Israel. And so in a famous story, Elijah challenged 450 prophets of Baal to a contest to see which god was real. So they both build altars and pray to their gods, but only the God of Israel answers with fire. After this, Ahab uses his royal power to murder an Israelite farmer and then steal his family's vineyard. And Elijah again confronts Ahab's injustice, and he announces the downfall of his house. Elijah eventually passes the mantle of his prophetic leadership to a young disciple named Elisha, who asks for 2 times the authority of Elijah. And what's fascinating here is how the author, he's recounted 7 miraculous feats for Elijah, and then he offers stories of 14 acts of power from Elijah. Both prophets were clearly remarkable men, and they played the same role, confronting Israel's kings for idolatry and injustice. In the next section, the northern kingdom is rocked by a bloody revolution started by a king named Jehu, who destroys Ahab's family. And although Jehu was at first commissioned by God, his violence just gets out of control, and it creates the spiral of political assassinations and rebellions from which Israel never recovered. Each king follows other gods, allows horrible injustice. It all leads up to 2 Kings chapter 17. The big bad empire of Assyria swoops down and takes out the northern kingdom altogether. In the capital city of Samaria, it's conquered, and the Israelites are exiled and scattered throughout the ancient world.
No matter what the prophets said, the kings of the northern kingdom of Israel just couldn't manage to remain faithful to God. They couldn't bring themselves to stop relying on their man-made idols for safety, wealth and comfort. So if not in the north, could such a king be found in Judah in the south? After all, God had promised that it would be a king from David's line that would rule his eternal kingdom. Who would this faithful, covenant-keeping king be?